It's been a manic week of negotiations for the war in Ukraine as the US puts forward a peace plan and awaits Russia's response. European leaders, meanwhile, are taking a different diplomatic path or forging their own path, holding several high-level meetings to present a united front and to push for greater security guarantees for Ukraine and Europe. So what might peace look like, and will Ukraine be forced into concessions to put an end to the fighting? Joining me is our resident analyst and host of the Security Brief, Mikey Kay, a former strategic military planner in the British military who flew assault helicopters for 20 years. And as always, Mikey will deliver this briefing as he would to his generals. Mikey, good to have you with us as ever. A huge amount going on this week. There is every week at the moment, especially when it comes to the field of security. Would you say there has been progress towards trying to end the fighting in Ukraine, first of all?
Define progress, Anita. It's an open-ended question at the moment, but you're right. There has been a plethora of meetings already this week. There's a number of really important meetings coming up that we can look forward to. So I thought I'd produce a timeline to help break this down. Slide, please. I think the first meeting of note was yesterday, and it was effectively all of the heads of the army meeting in Paris. Macron was in attendance. It was more than 30 countries, mainly European, as you would expect, but some outliers out there: Japan, Australia, Turkey, New Zealand, and Canada. And of note, the US were not in attendance yesterday. So,
do we know if they'd been invited or not?
I'm not aware. I'm pretty sure they will have known that the meeting was going on, but I think there'll also be a notion from European leaders that they want to get all of their issues and problems in one sock before they then go to the US and present. So it wouldn't surprise me if there's been a tacit conversation between the US and European leaders, with the US saying, look, go and sort your issues out and come back to us and tell us what you've concluded. But that said, the army chiefs will have been talking about pretty much military capability. They'll be looking at what the assessment of the threat is from Putin. They'll be looking at where the military capability vulnerabilities from Zelensky are. And in military parlance, we spoke about this in the form of the art of the possible. So what is the art of the possible? What capabilities are each country prepared to offer up? The size of the capability and troop numbers, logistical resupply. So they might be able to give a capability, but how long can that capability be sustained for by respective countries? And timelines. Does this capability actually require the training of any Ukrainian troops or armed forces Ukraine on this capability, or is it something like a Patriot missile system that will be operated by the respective countries? So lots of conversations there. There'll be a lot of nuances in that. There'll be a lot of discussions between the heads of the army, but also, this is just laying the foundation. We know today that the defense secretaries are all in Paris, and they will be taking all of that information that's come from the army chiefs and then underpinning that with the political optics in terms of who's going to provide what. So yes, they will have certain capabilities to provide, but what does that look like optically from the political side? Yeah,
just before we move on to discuss the Jeddah meeting, Mikey, in terms of the discussions that those army chiefs will be having, or had, I should say, would they be looking more at the bigger picture that you've just been discussing, or will they be taking almost real-time briefings about the situation on the ground in Ukraine and the relative positions of the Ukrainian forces and the Russian forces?
Yeah, a bit of both. It'll be a holistic view. And, sometimes, a loss of a tactical effect can have a strategic effect as well sometimes. So there'll be all that analysis going on for sure. For example, the US have provided Ukraine with 155mm artillery guns, howitzers, and 105s, and the UK has only 14 of those left in their own inventory. So that's a very simplistic example of what the UK won't be offering up. And so who else within that 30-country coalition of the willing, that they're calling it, will be able to provide that type of capability? Because it's certainly something that is a critical capability that Zelensky will want. But yeah, you're absolutely right. Going to that second meeting on the timeline. If we can go back to the slide, please, just so we can get a bit of situational awareness on that. This was the second important meeting of yesterday, and that, as you say, was the Jeddah meeting. Now, there are four really important outcomes from that meeting that we should go over. If we can go slide, please. This slide coming up, you'll see.
There we go.
Yeah, you'll see the first and key bit is the immediate 30-day ceasefire. Now, with all of these things, when it comes to negotiating ceasefires, the devil really is in the detail. And so far from what we've seen, there is no real detail on this. And what do I mean by detail? I mean, when is it going to happen? Immediately isn't helpful to anyone. We know that President Trump wants something done immediately, but it has to be aligned to a certain peg. It can't just be tomorrow. There have got to be preconditions surrounding it. So where will the ceasefire occur? I mean, is it along the entire border? Is it within Donetsk? Is it within all four regions? Is it across air, land, and sea? And how will any ceasefire be monitored? You know, this is a huge question, and we'll obviously talk about what the Europeans are speaking about later on in the brief on peacekeeping operations. But being able to monitor it and ensure that both the Ukrainians and the Russians are actually standing by that ceasefire is absolutely critical.
A huge number of questions, as you say, Mikey. Now, obviously, the tap has been turned back on in terms of US military aid to Ukraine and intelligence sharing, but it was turned off for a number of days. And I guess when you're in the thick of negotiations where both sides in a war want to project strength to be in the best possible position to negotiate, I wonder what the impact was on Ukraine of that intelligence sharing and military aid being turned off.
It was significant, and that's the key second point on the outcome. And I think the question you ask is absolutely valid, because what we're talking about is $2 billion worth of military capability per month that the US was providing to Ukraine. You turn that off and you have the Russians bearing down on Kursk, which we'll talk about a bit later. The Ukrainians are under a significant amount of pressure. That's going to hurt, and that's going to hurt a lot. But I think one specific example stood out to me involving the F-16 fighter jet. If we can go slide, please. They're two F-16s provided by the West and flown by Ukrainian pilots. And these have really come into their own. We had reports of one Ukrainian pilot shooting down 6 cruise missiles, Russian cruise missiles, in one mission a couple of weeks back. So the effect of the F-16 was significant. But when the US turned off the military aid, that affects them. It jeopardized the radar jammers that they put under the wings, and the radar jammers allow the jets to fly into high-risk areas, ameliorating the threat of surface-to-air missile systems being targeted at them. So that was increasing the
A really
risk.
dramatic example of the impact of switching off that aid, that assistance.
That military aid. And then when it comes to the intelligence sharing side, the Ukraine F-16s and the targeting cells lose all of the intelligence on what the target sets are that the F-16s are targeting. So again, they become under more high risk. And then you've got software updates for radar and jamming systems, weakening F-16 effectiveness against evolving Russian tactics. So you've got a buildup of degradation of capability that the F-16 jets were used to, and therefore you have to ground them because the risk is just too much for the pilots. Thankfully, the French actually delivered Mirage 2000 jets to the Ukrainians. We've got a slide. Yep, there we go. And they have been, to their best efforts, plugging the gap while those F-16s have been grounded. The French Mirages are now in operation, and the first downing of a cruise missile by a Ukrainian pilot flying a Mirage 2000 occurred just in the last week. So the reintroduction of this military aid and intelligence will allow those F-16 jets to get back up in the air and synergize with the Mirage 2000s, giving Zelensky the air defense capability that he now requires.
Now, we've been talking about those meetings in Paris, and we know there are G7 meetings taking place in Canada about the situation vis-a-vis Ukraine and Russia. So Looking at the UK and Europe's positions specifically, the UK and the EU's positions specifically on what the US is saying and what Ukraine is saying at the moment, what are the UK EU positions? Because they are trying to position themselves, if you like, between the US, which, as we've discussed, has been turning off aid, turning it back on again. They're a little bit, unsure of what potentially is going to happen next. So how are the UK and the EU trying to position themselves in the middle of all of this?
Well, I mean, the UK has and Europe and European leaders have a massive dog in this fight in terms of the security of the European continent. We know that that the US were in Jeddah in Saudi Arabia with Zelensky. But we had little information on where the Europeans were in those negotiations. And we saw, coming out of the meeting, we saw Marco Rubio and Waltz, who were discussing, these 4 points effectively that we're talking about. And my big question when I was watching that was, where are the Europeans in this process? Was there any European representation in Jeddah? But it's come out over the last 24 hours that Jonathan Powell, who is Keir Starmer's national security advisor, he actually flew to Ukraine to see President Zelensky last week. And the whole point of that was to help draft a peace proposal that Zelensky will have taken to Jeddah and presented to the Americans. So it's transpired that the UK have definitely been involved in this, and obviously with the coalition of the willing, you're going to have Powell and Keir Starmer sort of sharing, that advice that's gone to Zelensky, and then that sort of iterative feedback that's going to come out from the meeting via Zelensky to Jonathan Powell, to Keir Starmer, which will then be shared in a greater context later on this week at one of the next meetings that we're looking at.
So the hand of the UK and Keir Starmer very much present there through the medium of Jonathan Powell. We are going to take a very short break from the security brief. We'll be back with more in just a moment around the world and across the UK. This is BBC News. You're watching The Context on BBC News. Back now to the security brief with Mikey Kay. And just picking up on where we finished before the break, a week or so ago, we were constantly talking about and hearing about a minerals deal and what Ukraine could offer the United States by way of a minerals deal. Was it going to be signed? Was it not going to be signed? That's gone a little quiet, I think, in the last few days. But where are we on that?
So that was point 4 that came out from the Jeddah meeting. Just as a refresher, we can bring slide 2 up, please. And yeah, slide 4 is all about minerals. You're right, we have been speaking about this ad infinitum. What was presented originally at the Munich Security Conference has evolved and evolved and evolved, and it has gone quiet. But the huge question underpinning all of that process, regardless of how much or how little or how much the proposal has changed, is the lack of information on what Zelensky wants, which is a security guarantee. And we've spoken at length about this, but I think it's important to go over again in terms of how do you define security guarantee? Is a security guarantee a peacekeeping force with NATO troops in Europe? Is a security guarantee Zelensky being able to keep hold of the partially or fully occupied regions. And just as a refresher, if we can bring slide up of those regions, please.
Yeah, useful to look at this again.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, this is the contested area that has evolved since 2014 and the start of the war in 2022. At the top there, you've got Luhansk, then Donetsk, Zaporizhzhia, and then down in the bottom left hand of the screen, you've got Kherson region. And these are either fully occupied or partially occupied by Russia. And the big question for Zelensky is when he's talking about security guarantees under the context of the minerals deal, is he talking about these four regions? And the other thing that we've got to remember about this region as well is there is a significant amount of mineral wealth in this region. Now, Trump's implication, and I think this is as much as we've garnered from what we've heard, but Trump is implying some form of security guarantee with the fact that you'll have US contractors, you'll have US companies in there trying to get access to those minerals and excavate those minerals, and by de facto that you have American citizens on the ground.
He said this in the Oval Office one day, didn't he?
Right.
US citizens on the ground was in itself a form of security guarantee. I mean, I'm not sure from a security perspective whether you think that amounts to a strong security guarantee, Mikey.
Well, I think contemporary history would argue that I wouldn't place a lot of trust in Trump's handshake or Trump's gentleman's agreement. And there are a couple of examples, recent examples of that. The Syrian Democratic Forces in Syria, they were the US's critical ally in the fight against the Islamic State. They were thrown under the bus by Trump. And then more recently at the Doha Accords, which were the negotiations for Afghanistan, the government of Afghanistan, which not just the US, but the UK, all of NATO have been training and mentoring and applied billions and billions of dollars into the government of Afghanistan to establish an Afghan national army, an Afghan national police, its own special forces wing, its own aviation wing. They were completely sidelined by Trump and his delegation, and the entire power agreement was given to the Taliban. So in terms of that trust, and Zelensky's been on record saying that he doesn't trust Trump, but he will go for the ceasefire. I think he has absolutely every right to have that mindset.
And in terms of the presence of a reassurance force, call it what you will, obviously President Putin of Russia has said he does not want NATO troops in that area, but then it's a negotiation, a compromise, one assumes. So we just don't know what's going to happen on that front, but clearly that's all part of the discussion still. And then speaking of NATO, of course, we are expecting Mark Rutte, the Secretary General of NATO, to be trying to persuade Donald Trump to, come around to NATO's way of thinking on this. He described himself in London last week as a good friend of Donald Trump. He's been described as the Trump whisperer. So what might he bring to the conversation? Well,
I mean, the NATO Sec General is his primary objective, his number one priority is to protect the integrity of NATO. And, we all know that the most critical aspect of NATO's capability is the contribution of the United States of America.
And there's the timeline. He's due tomorrow in Washington.
Right. And I think, again, this will be an important visit. This is the third important meeting that's occurring. And we know this because the Secretary General told the BBC that Zelensky needs to find a way to restore the relationship with Trump and the administration. And he's on record saying that. So, you could argue he's taking the side of the Trump administration, but you can also argue, we were speaking about this earlier, that you pointed out that he's actually protecting NATO's best interests, because he knows that if Trump did decide to leave NATO, then that would leave NATO in quite a compromised place when it comes to that deterrent.
And presumably that's his priority.
Yeah, 100%. And, the whole policy of NATO is Article 5, collective self-defense. An attack on one is an attack on all. And that hard power is absolutely critical to have the US's military capability behind it. And then Rutte also told, the NATO Secretary General also told Zelensky face to face that we really have to respect what Trump has done so far for Ukraine. So I think there's a lot of political posturing there from the NATO Secretary General. He's got to be overtly seen to be protecting NATO, but at the same time not siding with Ukraine, so he can keep Trump on side, because Trump is unpredictable, and it's
all the while trying to bring those two sides together.
Right, and it's the unpredictability that has thrown Europe into chaos. It's thrown the UK into chaos, and that has really made the NATO Secretary General question, the future of NATO and what it looks like. Does it involve America or does it not involve America? Bearing in the context that we're talking about 4 years of Trump's presidency, and should a Democratic president get in, then I'm sure that would be reversed rather quickly.
And let's just pivot back to a little bit more detail then on what that European bloc of NATO are discussing with regards to peacekeeping forces, reassurance forces.
Yeah, and this is, if we can go to the timeline again, this is the last important meeting that's happening on the weekend, and it's the UK Prime Minister Keir Starmer who's leading a virtual summit on Ukraine security. And I think where this is going is that on yesterday you had the army chiefs talking about capability. Now you've got the Secretary of Defences of all of Europe in Paris talking about what the army chiefs, or the conclusions of what the army chiefs have said and what the conclusions are for that. And now I think, the big conversation is that you, as you said, you still have European leaders talking about peacekeeping operations. Now, I find it quite interesting that there are these conversations going on, because the only way that could possibly ever happen is if Putin accepted that. And we've known for a long time, going back to the 2021 draft proposal that Putin gave to Lavrov gave to Blinken in Switzerland, basically putting the demands, these are the demands on Ukraine. This is what we want Ukraine to undergo, which is a capping of the army and no foreign forces inside Ukraine territory. And then you've got the Istanbul Protocol of 2022, or the Putin's demand in Istanbul in 2022, which was all about NATO. It was Article 4 and it was Article 6, and it basically spoke about non-expansion of NATO, which has already occurred because we've seen Sweden and Finland on that front, but no expansion of deployed forces inside Europe and inside Ukraine. So with that in mind, let's assume that Putin does acquiesce to that. What's the framework of what any European forces in Ukraine might look like? Because the framework's absolutely key, Anita, because the framework will generate or influence what the rules of engagement are. And you've got two potential scenarios there. You've got the Article 5 scenario, highly unlikely, which is an attack on one, which is an attack on all. So if you have a so-called peacekeeping force made up of predominantly NATO countries, and they then get attacked by Russian forces, that can't have an Article 5 on it, because obviously that will escalate. And then you've got another example of UN peacekeeping operations, which is Chapter 6 and Chapter 7. Chapter 6 being non-lethal, and Chapter 7 being Security Council giving or being able to use force as a way to counter anything within that framework.
And there's clearly a huge amount of detail to be thrashed out, isn't there?
Yeah.
Look, I think it's obvious that throughout all of this process, traditional allegiances and military and intelligence relationships have been tested, haven't they? Including the Five Eyes group. Just remind us who they are.
Yeah, I mean, we've got a nice slide here just to sort of depict that, but it's effectively a coalition of 5 countries: Australia, UK, Canada, US, and New Zealand. And the Five Eyes intelligence sharing relationship, and there's a bit of a paradox here. The irony is that it was formed in 1946 to counter Russian aggression. And here we are now looking at the potential relationship being compromised. These raise big questions. So we've had former Australian PM Malcolm Turnbull, who we spoke to earlier to BBC News, on the potential for changing intelligence relationships, and this is what he said.
Well, the first thing to remember about Five Eyes is that America is the biggest eye, the biggest gatherer of signals intelligence, and so it shares, its product that it shares with the UK, Canada, Australia, and New Zealand is much more than what we share, the other members share with the US. No country in the Five Eyes shares everything with the others. Nobody. So I think that there will be, particularly in the UK, where there's a lot of intelligence gathered in the European theatre and that may pertain or be of interest to Russia, I think there will be great care taken. I mean, it is of concern. I mean, Trump has basically changed sides in Ukraine.
And I think a realistic example of that is the UK will have human assets inside China and Russia. They might be compromised through a leak.
OK. So much more we could be talking about. As I said at the beginning of the programme, so much to talk about in terms of security at the moment. Mikey, thank you very much for leading us through the security brief. And you'll be back next Wednesday with more?
Hope so. OK,
Mikey Kay, thank you very much. And thank you for watching the programme. Do stay with us, though, on BBC News. Much more to come. We'll be keeping you right up to date around the world and across the UK. This is BBC News.